All right, well, while we're waiting, I might just introduce myself. So my name's Alex Birch, and I'm CEO and co-founder of XY Sense. XY Sense has been around since 2016, but before that, I also co-founded another company in the Proptech space called SaraView. You might have heard of SaraView. It's an office space management platform that helps large organizations understand their teams, where their people are, booking desks, etc. Here we go. I can accompany it with pictures. And that started in 2007 and saw quite some success around the world. And therefore, I was lucky enough to engage with many large real estate companies and understand their pain points. And as we all know here, most likely we all know that real estate is the second or third biggest expense for most organizations around the world. So it's a huge cost. And even pre-pandemic, offices was not really very well used. So back in 2016, we kept having these huge challenges, these huge pain points articulated. We don't know how much space we're using. We don't know what types of space we're using. We don't know how to design the future office. And we really need help with that. And SaraView was a SaaS platform, and it relied on third parties to feed this information in to help make decisions. And none of the market really was able to provide this information to answer those questions. So I stepped away from SaraView to form XY Sense. And before I get into more details about that, what I'd like to talk about today is some of the insights we see from around the world about how offices are being used and some really interesting trends. It's going to overlap slightly with Jane, but I think it should be unique enough if you saw Jane's yesterday to still be informed. And look, it's a small audience, so I'd love for you all to shout out if you've got questions, and feel free to heckle even if you want to. But yeah, let's keep this interactive. So something that not everyone really thinks about is for these large organizations, the main thing I hear from workplace leaders is they want people to come back in and they don't want any friction in between that. They want to be able to incentivize people to come back in, and anytime there's a roadblock, that disincentivizes people to come in. But what that actually ends up leaving is what we call an elephant in the room, that there's this huge amount of wasted space and energy and costs that contribute to that. And when you consider that on a global scale, it's actually pretty phenomenal. A very conservative way of looking at the amount of leasing costs globally is around about $600 billion annually. That's quite a big figure, but if you think about our statistics, well, we measure about 35% utilized. So all the spaces around the world, all the office spaces, 65% sit empty at any one time. That's roughly $380 billion worth of wasted space. It's huge. But on top of that, 40% of the world's carbon emissions come from the built environment. So if you consider the energy, all these buildings that are empty, especially on Mondays and Fridays, they're heated, cleaned, cooled, security, they're open, all so that there's little friction between people coming in and into the office. It's an incredible amount of waste. And how do we know this? Annually, we capture about 100 billion data points across 42,000 office spaces. And it says 19 countries there, but we're actually 20 countries now, so and growing. All around the world you can see. And the common theme is large enterprise. And how our actual sensors work, you can see 2 above you. There's 2 up here measuring, and there's also 3 across the space. But we're able to understand anonymously what types of space people are using. So you can see an example here where people are walking around. This is our office, someone walking up to their desk. We can understand what types of space are being used, and this person here sits down, and you'll see that space becomes occupied. So we've got that very high fidelity accuracy across all different types of space, whether it's a meeting room, whether it's a desk. And more relevant to here is this is yesterday. So this is a time lapse that we've recorded with all of the sensors across the space. And you can see there's a panel with the 3 people, well, there were 3 chairs yesterday, and all the action throughout this space. I think this was a 10:30 talk. So seems like there's about the same number of people here today as yesterday. So that's pretty good. And then you'll see as the speech finished, people will move out, and we're building a heat map over time. And that space there in the middle is actually the coffee machine. So the busiest spot out of everyone there, the winner is the coffee machine. So it's actually quite fascinating to see this. You can rebuild, you can load it at any time, and you can see sort of trends and understand how many people are using the space. But that gives you a good idea of how we're capturing this data. All right, so in the last 12-ish months, in the most recent quarter, we're actually seeing it flatten out in terms of usage of space globally. Round about the 40% mark, which is still a lower number than what it was pre-pandemic. Pre-pandemic was maybe 55, 60%. Now we're at the 40%. but it is increasing. And if you look, our data set was a bit smaller because we've been a pretty fast growing company, but back then this was more Australasia. We were seeing 65% utilization, which was pretty much the average globally. Then obviously went straight down. We had the different variants. Remember the Delta variant? All the way back, we're seeing a slow, steady increase. And we think there's two reasons for that. One is organizations are consolidating their space and reducing the total number of space that they've got because less people are coming in. But also there's a trend that even for exactly the same offices, more people are coming in and the utilization numbers are increasing. And that trend is common across the world. So the UK, as Dan said, the UK is in the lead, which is nice and easy to present to you guys. You've increased your utilization from 34% to 52%, but across the rest of the world, at the lower end is the US at 30%. And I'm glad, let's just say I'm not presenting in Canada right now, but you can see that the UK is well ahead, and there's a lot of reasons for that. One is you've actually got a great connected transport system, well, when you're not on strike. You also have like that after work culture. You walk around, you can see it's really a great environment to be at work, and you've also got some really thriving workplaces. So compare that to one of the ones that is one of the fastest growing countries for us, which is India. India, they're also, it's maybe a much longer commute. We're really seeing high utilization there. And some of the reason for that, we think, is, well, some of the offices being built there are absolutely beautiful. And perhaps going to an oasis of an office versus where you are at home is a good reason for people to come in. All right, and then the days of the week. So the Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday is definitely well consistent across the world. You can see the different colors. The current is blue, so the blue is definitely the highest. And there is a slight raise on the Monday. We're seeing Monday becoming more of a mainstay in usage versus what we see comparatively on a Friday. And to be fair, pre-pandemic, Friday wasn't exactly that high compared to the rest of the week as well, but it's still quite the drop-off. So really, we're trying to organize for 3 days a week versus 5 across the world. And then this one's quite interesting. If you look at this stat, we're looking at work points occupied by hour. And if you take this block here, the red and the green, that's 50% of all the work points we measure have either no occupancy or less than 1 hour. So that's an incredible stat. So many desks being put in that are hardly used at all. And that's across our global portfolio, and it's fairly consistent. And very, very few people, maybe HR, I don't know, are sitting at their desks all day. But more consistently, you're seeing far more desks being built than actually people using. And then you compare that to collaboration areas. So collaboration areas are definitely far more used. This is work point utilization versus collaboration areas in terms of the number of hours a day, in terms of the progression over time. It's been quite consistent. And then looking at the different types of space, we've got workstations here. So hours used a day, all the way up to all of these are collaboration spaces. So all the new offices we're seeing are being designed far heavily with collaboration spaces in mind. But how big should those spaces be? They definitely use more hours a day. There's been an increase in even the individual phone booth usage as well as the open collaboration areas, and a decrease in individual focus areas. And if you break that down across the different capacity rooms, it's pretty obvious that you look at the black is the number of total spaces available per size of room. Even for the large rooms, you're still getting a low average capacity, 8.6 people. So there's quite a theme here that we design and engineer meeting rooms to be larger than what they need to be. I mean, if I asked you, do you want the smaller or the larger office? Everyone's going to take the larger office. But in terms of being effective in design, really we're over-designing the number of meeting rooms in terms of their capacity. I want to talk about a case study that sort of re-emphasizes that. This is for a financial client of ours, where on the left here is the usage of their desks. The blue line here is the total number of desks they have. The red is over the last 3 months on a daily basis, what the peak was. So the peak is around about 10 a.m. They hit 400. And then the green is the average. So there's a massive gap between the number of desks available and the number of desks used. You compare that to rooms, you can see a very different story. They were flatlining across that period. So their peak was at any hour of the day, there was no rooms available. And then you look at the number of attendees, 2.8 average attendees, and 90% of the capacity of those meetings were 4 people or fewer. So the obvious solution here is, well, we've got all this desk space. We've got very small meetings occurring. So let's take some desk space out and put some individual phone booths and 2-person phone booths. And as a result, that was their bottleneck. They're able to solve their bottleneck. So that's a very quick snapshot of all the stats we're looking at around the world. When you align that to what we hear and what the market is telling us from what the goals of large organizations are, this is a CBRE study in 23 and 24. Obviously, optimize portfolio, save costs, make it better for our people, if you really wanted to summarize in those words. So with those two things in mind, how do you go about that without having the fidelity of data? And what we used to measure this as, I don't know if anyone used to have the cost per desk, or maybe still do. Globally, it was around about, I think, 12,000, 13,000 pounds on average per desk per year. I'm seeing a lot more now that people aren't using that metric to measure. Instead, they're thinking about a cost per visit. So if you've got people who are coming in 1 day a week, 2 days a week, and you divide the total cost of your asset by the number of visits, how much is that cost per visit? And some of you might actually, well, maybe not in the UK. If I'm delivering this in Canada, it's probably a little bit worse. But if you divide it by the total number of visits, it actually could be astronomically higher, which means you really have to think very carefully about the value of that asset. And a new challenge, here's the day of the week as well. There's a definite peak, and it's 1 or 2 days a week where your asset is high tension because there's so many people in, it might be hard to find space. The rest of the time, it's quite empty. So you've got a good vibe. So on busy days, some floors are even too busy to go to. On quiet days, the vibe is poor. Why did I bother commuting to come in? It leads to all of those things I was speaking about before, with energy saving potential, with the cost of security, all of those aspects. It presents a very different problem that we didn't have before. So in an ideal world, and across the world, I would say that we're very much in our infancy in terms of who's implemented this. But to be able to operationally reduce costs, you need to be able to dynamically turn floors on and off. So if you got a 1,000-seat building on a Friday, you only open half your floors. There are so many challenges in the way that we have set up in the last 100 years to stop that from being a reality easily. Whether or not you have regulatory reasons where you can't put business units together, where you've got things where rooms are booked. How do you actually shut down a floor where all the rooms have been booked on that floor on that day? There's so many challenges in the way, but our dream is to be able to help enable organizations to have the data to actually deliver to that effect and be more efficient and effective. Therefore, you have a net saving and use less energy expenditure. It's operational and you've got an increased vibe. But add to that, potentially in the future, what if you could have the security to enable your space to be used by others when it's not busy? That would be the optimal way of doing it. There's a lot of security to get through to get past that. But that's one of our visionary ultimate dreams to help. All right. So as I said, we haven't seen anyone get to that point where they've really been able to activate and dynamically turn floors on and off, but we're working through that journey. But what we have here is what we call the occupancy intelligence curve. You got to crawl, walk, run. You need to really understand exactly what your goals that you're trying to achieve are, and have a strategy that gives technology a connected integration so that you're not just putting things in that are siloed and unable to unlock value from other areas. So all the way from the left, where perhaps you're doing annual space planning or hoteling, to all the way to what I mentioned before, dynamic floor balancing, be able to turn floors on and off and have your data integrate with your entire platform. So the way we talk about it is, look, it's actually not a small investment to invest in any sort of a tech solution. So any solution you need to invest in, you need to have it unsiloed and have what we call vectors of value. Whether or not you're reducing costs, whether or not you're integrating into well-being, operating costs, all of those aspects are considerations that you should put on to any technology you purchase. It's obvious, the more business units that are getting value out of it, the more beneficial it is. But understanding what that roadmap is super important. And what we say, it's okay to crawl, walk, run. Make sure you understand what your roadmap is, but then identify your first key objective. And large enterprise could take 6, 12 months to achieve that, even longer. So have that roadmap, work towards the goal, and hopefully you'll see that success. So in summary, the elephant in the room really for us is the incredible amount of wasted space that is being paid for and is being powered and lit, heated and cooled and cleaned. And the focus really across what we see around the world is let's get people back as best we can, but let's not plan for the waste. Maybe that's a tomorrow problem, but collectively, if we actually raise the awareness of it, there's a huge opportunity to make a difference. So that's the end of my quick talk. Thank you for your audience, but hopefully we've got some time for some questions. If anyone has a question, I'm happy to ask. Dan.
So yeah, can you talk more about the vibe metric? You said one of your clients uses a vibe metric, and that's how they understand, whether the office is successful or not.
Yeah, so the vibe, in terms of a qualitative measure, everyone really talks about that energy or the buzz factor. And if people are coming into a space where it's empty or you barely talk to people, unless you're introverted, typically organizations feel that they don't have that community and that social impact. In terms of quantifying it, we quantify as being not too busy. It's not. There's no scientific measure of like 60 to 70% or something like that. But where there is higher utilization, there is a buzz and there's a real vibe, and you can just actually feel it. The conference yesterday, there was a real buzz happening because we had so many people here. So that's the aspect we're relating to. Yeah, the buzz is pretty good now. So thanks everyone for your attendance. Any other questions? Yeah, good question. So the question is it possible to see whether people are having a conversation or interacting? And actually, with our sensors, they're computer vision based. So they're able to, a good analogy, if you're up there looking down and you could see something, then the sensor can see it. So we're able to train and put new algorithms on the sensor. We don't currently do conversations, but we have a beta release where we're able to distinguish between sitting and standing, which is a human behavior that we're able to add. On that roadmap is using a computer. Am I on the phone? And am I interacting? So you have more dimensions of data into your space. Another dimension we're looking to do is actually incorporating air quality as well. So we can provide global indexes on air quality versus occupancy.
So if the sensor's optical, how do you make sure that you can't read a contract on a desk for like cybersecurity and privacy?
All right. So from the ground up, the reason why we call ourselves XY Sense is nothing leaves the sensor other than anonymous XY coordinates. That's for our engineers. That's for anyone. We have independent annual penetration tests to make sure that that's the fact. So it would be a lot easier to stream video everywhere and then be able to count people that way. But privacy would mean that is therefore impossible. Well, we wouldn't sell very many units, let's put it that way. So the actual sensor itself wouldn't even be able to get to the fidelity of reading contracts on a desk or reading lines on a computer. But regardless, no one ever sees the images from the sensor anyway.
Is it possible to ingress an external API at all into your analysis as well? So rather than just your own proprietary sensors, do you ingress it from other hardware as well?
So can we take other feeds from other data? We certainly look at other feeds where it makes sense. There's a lot of different ways of sourcing the data. And in our opinion, you're only really as good as the lowest common denominator. And you have to understand the accuracy and the inaccuracy of certain systems. So we will never open the floodgates and allow every sort of data in, but we're certainly looking at other sources of data such as conference room cameras that can do head counting. There's no point in putting a sensor in if you've got a conference room camera. Part of the reason for XY Sense was because at CeraView, my previous company, we implemented a Wi-Fi trilateration algorithm, taking a Cisco feed, taking an Aruba feed, and we just did not see the accuracy that was claimed. And unless you're flooding your organization with Wi-Fi access points, then you're not getting the accuracy you need. And if you're doing that, you might as well actually put a sensor in, which we have a coverage range which is far greater than, say, a Cisco access point. So it's actually more cost effective to do that. So the answer is we do that in a very pragmatic way where the source is accurate enough. And we do a lot of diligence on that to make sure the data is accurate.
Thank you. Just in terms of the occupancy statistics, from the clients you're working with, to what extent are management teams accepting those figures and responding in the way you've outlined, or using the data to say, we need to change this organization, we need to get people back in?
I think that's a really good question. No workplace leader that I've met wants to show to their board that they're using 20% of their space. So we have a consistent way of reporting for utilization, which doesn't change in our metrics, but on an individual customer basis, they have the capability to define what capacity. We treat capacity as all your desks plus all of your meeting rooms. Some customers put the egress-ingress limits as their capacity. Others choose just the total number of desks. So that means you can turn 20% into 45%. So
thank you. That was exceptional. It was a brilliant talk. Thank you. Loads of takeaways. So I just wanted to ask, one of the challenges is scaling the sensors globally. I think one of you typically will get a new HQ or a couple of levels in a building, and it kind of makes sense. You can put the sensors in, but then you try and take that across 40,000 desks, 80,000 staff globally, big businesses. How are you sort of navigating that with your clients to sort of show the value beyond the initial uses?
Yeah, that's also a really good question. So we have not had a deployment where we have gone full blanket across an enterprise globally from day one. It's been, let's start with the floor, let's start establishing value. And I spoke about the vectors of value, increase the number of vectors that you're actually delivering value to with a customer. We also have a gated way of doing it. We have an entry sensor there that can count the thresholds of people coming in. So for smaller spaces, just putting entry sensors in the building. Then perhaps putting it on the floor so you can see a live floor count. And we've actually been really successful in growth with customers where we have, on average, I think we see a 3x growth from a customer's first deployment to 12 months later. They're going across multiple spaces. So, and we do have some full global deployments where we started in a building and now we're deployed globally around the world across 5 or 6 countries, I think, as well.
Really quick one. Well, probably another quick one. What's your best case study of where you've deployed these sensors technologies and where the client has actually taken those insights and reimagined or redesigned the workplace, and how quickly did they do that? In terms of from when the learnings happened and how quickly they actually rearranged the workplace.
Yeah, so a really good example of that. I'm not sure if you heard a talk yesterday on data in the workplace. Sanofi were talking there. Sanofi is one of our customers, which we're deploying globally with. They've changed the way that they design their space based on our data and reduced the number of larger meeting rooms, reduced the number of desks, and increased the smaller collaboration spaces. And they've fed that into design globally and also have reduced the amount of space globally that they've leased as a result. So there have been significant cost savings in future lease costs, as well as increased well-being for their team because they're able to understand they are rearranging, but they're also doing that into future design as well because they are building a number of new projects. And the other case study that you might have seen on my slide, that was from a finance sector. Unfortunately, a lot of our customers are rather shy in giving their name away, but that was a finance sector where they had the real bottleneck of not enough meeting rooms, and they were able to action that change with even small pods, which you don't need to do a capital works fit out for. So you can do smaller fit out changes to adjust and have a value return.
I might just add an example because I'm your customer, or Sandoz is your customer, and we use your sensors at our key locations. And the way how we do it, it's not like we have a plan to implement XY sense in every single one of our office. That would be, frankly, quite expensive, but it's not the end goal. So we take these insights and the findings from our key offices and we build it in our space calculator. So we understand what are the needs in that region and what is the behavior of our associates in that region and what should be the representative of how much square meters of a meeting rooms I need versus work points and the other type of spaces. So we don't necessarily change the office we already built. That's sometimes difficult. You can change few desks for a phone booth or something similar like that. But the key findings, what we find, are used for building the new offices. So when we build new office, we now have a blueprint how it should look like.
Awesome. Thanks, Carol. And I did not ask Carol to do that, so thank you for that shout out. And I actually forgot about one key integration, which is into our partners to add value as well. So smart spaces, feeding our data into smart spaces to enable things like no-show cancellations in rooms and into the wider ecosystem of all the reporting as well. So that's another vector of value definitely that I didn't talk through. All right. Are we at time? Are there any more questions?
Hi, just a quick question around any nuances that you see on that meeting room utilization data that you showed before. Do you see any major differences in different countries? The meeting room utilization data that you showed before, are there any significant nuances or differences between the different locations globally?
Yeah, so that is actually pretty consistent. I will say that Australia is Monday and Friday is the biggest gap between Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday for Australia. So we like our long weekends there. Specifically with meeting rooms, though, I think it's pretty consistent across the group, really. It's actually quite phenomenal whether you look at the finance sector, the technology sector, philanthropy, or even higher ed. There's very similar utilization patterns across that. I mean, there's a common denominator of we're in an office and we need to collaborate.
Just curious about how you track your data in terms of comparison. So, for example, how many people are in the office compared to the weather that day, the seasons? Like, do you find that there's higher occupancy during hotter days and lower during the winter times? And based on countries as well, like, for example, India.
Seasonality is definitely a big factor of that. So August, September, we see reduction in numbers, obviously, and in the alternate climate where Australia's winter is July, we see the downturn in December, January. So it's definitely seasonality. We looked into a couple of years ago whether mask mandates actually had a difference in the number of people attending. We thought it was going to be a certainty, but it was actually only about a 5% drop in utilization. We've done the transport strike definitely had an impact last year. And Jane and I were yesterday looking at the data and the drop in the UK data and looking for reasons behind that, but definitely the transport strike was one. And then seasonality of weather does certainly have an impact, but because it's a global, weather is only localized, so it doesn't dramatically impact. But in terms of predicting, if you were to predict for a space how many people are going to turn up, weather is going to influence it heavily. So,
are any of your customers in the flex space or serviced office industry monetize the meeting rooms, and like do they run the data of like the revenue for the rooms and basically use that to improve their service?
Yeah, we have some co-working spaces in our data set, and their asset is the physical space. So the more utilized it is, obviously their revenue is going to be higher. How far they've gone down that path, I'd still say it's in its infancy. The data we're providing is very informative, but they're using it to feed into future design versus tweaking. And there's definitely a huge business case to help in that space for sure.
Are your sensors like designed to work in different spaces than offices, like for example plants or labs where the conditions are quite different?
Yeah, for sure. I actually once had a question: can we count cattle? So we don't do that, but our sensors are trained to understand humans. But whether it's basically indoors. So we have some deployments in laboratories. We both count the number of people coming into the laboratories as well as how many people are using different space types in the laboratories. One thing is it is line of sight. So if you've got large units that are in the way, you need to be strategic about how you position your sensors. The other thing about laboratories are a lot of them are wet labs. So they're going to spray water and our sensors are not ISO 57 rated. So you couldn't put them in a wet space.
I've got to do a bit of a futurist question, if that's all right. Because if you were to project 5 years from now and you've got all of your in-room AV, you've got your BLEs in your intelligent lighting systems, you've got your access logs all interfaced with your reservation systems, like where does this fit in 5 years, 10 years time? Like, is it something that's just off the moment to help people correct how they use their real estate? And then once they've made that correction, it's superfluous? Or how does it maintain? How's it sticky? How does it maintain it over time?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's the use case to help optimize an office, and then in theory, it's optimized. So do we still need it? I get that. And what we also do is understand neighborhoods of where people are in groups and how frequently people are using those neighborhoods. And most organizations are not staying flat in size. They're growing, projects are coming on, they're merging, those sorts of things. And to be able to get a good experience for your teams, you might see that you've got an overall utilization in a building of 60%, but unless you look at the details, maybe on level 5, it's 85%. And you need to balance that and consistently change how many teams are allocated to each neighborhood. So there's an ongoing use case to be able to use the data to give a great experience. Now, that said, with your question in the true futurist sense, where there's existing data sources that are accurate enough, we think it's okay to leverage there. You don't have to go use our sensors. But what we do, very different to what we see in the market, is very accurately capture it in a scalable way. And there's nothing that really delivers it to the level of accuracy that we have. 5 years' time, maybe there will be devices. So we're not a hardware company, we're a data company, and understanding that data and trying to help organizations do better with it. All right. Thumbs up. Enough questions. All right. Well, thank you for your audience. Lots of great questions, and I hope it was informative.